I was just 17 when my life changed forever, carrying the child of a boy from one of the wealthiest families in town. Looking back now, I still remember the sting of his father's cruel words when we first met, condemning me solely for my humble background. Little did I know then that months later, something unimaginable would happen that would make that same man ashamed of how he treated me. That morning, like so many others, I was startled awake by my little brother Oliver's crying. The old alarm clock on my nightstand showed 6 a.m., its red numbers glowing in the dim light of dawn. I rushed out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor, knowing I needed to tend to Oliver before his cries woke Mom, who was still recovering from a severe bout of flu. With trembling hands, I scraped together what little formula we had left, prepared his bottle, and cradled him close as he drank. Those moments in the early morning light were always bittersweet, reminding me of how much our lives had changed in the 3 years since Dad abandoned us. Since then, I'd become the primary caregiver, supporting both my sick mother and maintaining our tiny house in the working-class district. After settling Oliver back to sleep, I began my daily routine with mechanical precision. I pulled on my old, worn jeans and an oversized t-shirt that hung loose on my thin frame, hastily tying my hair back in a messy ponytail. Vanity was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore, both in time and money. In our small kitchen, I heated up a simple noodle soup from our dwindling pasta supply. After checking that Mom was still sleeping peacefully, I headed out to my part-time job at the local bakery. The owner, Nicholas, was an elderly gentleman who had taken pity on my situation and given me work. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Oliver in formula and food. Each morning, I'd greet Nicholas with genuine gratitude, put my apron on, and serve the few customers who came seeking fresh bread. Sometimes, Nicholas would save the day-old pastries and bread for me, gently insisting I take them home to my sick mother. After several hours of work that morning, I took my first break. Still wearing my flour-dusted apron, I hurried to the corner grocery store to buy a small amount of sugar for the meager noodle soup I prepared for Mom and Oliver. As I reached for the cheapest package of sugar, a contemptuous voice behind me made my heart freeze. "What's a poor girl like you going to do with that sugar?" I turned to face 3 young men about my age, their expensive clothes and sneering expressions making my stomach churn. The one in the middle, I recognized immediately, was Zachary, the son of a prominent financial company owner in the city. With all the dignity I could muster, I looked them in the eye and told them I was taking it home. One of Zachary's friends mockingly asked about the price, suggesting I couldn't even afford such a basic item in my shabby clothes. Fighting back tears of humiliation, I tried to push past them to the register, pleading to be left alone so I could return to work. But the trio of privileged boys blocked my path until Zachary, after looking me up and down with obvious disdain, suddenly told his friends to stop and paid for the sugar himself. My blood was boiling with anger and shame, but I couldn't risk causing more trouble. I reluctantly accepted his gesture, clutching the sugar to my chest as I hurried out of the store, hot tears of anger streaming down my face. I rushed back to the bakery, trying to lose myself in the morning rush of customers and forget the humiliating encounter with those wealthy boys. By noon, I headed home to share the modest soup with Mom and tend to Oliver. As I took off my apron and said goodbye to Nicholas, my hands were still shaking from the morning's events. Suddenly, I felt someone following me. When I turned around, there was Zachary, walking a few feet behind me with an arrogant smile playing on his lips. I walked faster, but he kept pursuing me until he caught up. I turned to him angrily, demanding to know why he was following me, and asking him to leave me alone. His response was dripping with false innocence as he asked if this was how I showed gratitude for his generosity with the sugar, claiming he was just trying to be kind. Without breaking my stride, I shot back that his kindness rang hollow after the way he'd treated me earlier. But this persistent young man caught up with me again, his tone noticeably softer this time. He admitted that his behavior at the store had been wrong. As we walked away from the grocery store, he confessed that he sometimes acted foolishly to impress his friends, then added that he actually thought I was very pretty and wanted to take me out sometime. I studied his face with skepticism, but the arrogance I'd seen earlier had been replaced by an almost puppyish expression of remorse. Could it be possible that one of these wealthy, entitled boys was actually apologizing to me? His sudden change in attitude left me bewildered, but something in his eyes made me decide to give him a chance. In a softer voice, I told him I would forgive him if he promised never to treat me that way again, adding that I needed to go because my mother was waiting. His face lit up with excitement as he promised he wouldn't make me regret it, asking for my phone number so he could call and take me somewhere nice. Despite myself, I couldn't help but smile a little. Perhaps I had misjudged him after all. I gave him my number, and he finally let me go, calling after me that he'd phone soon to ask me out. That night, after feeding Mom her soup and spending hours playing with Oliver, I was exhausted but found myself falling asleep with a small smile on my face. For the first time in what felt like years, I had a reason to feel a glimmer of hope. The next morning, I was once again awakened by Oliver's crying. When I rushed to get up, I was surprised to find Mom already out of bed, holding my little brother in her arms. In her weak voice, she assured me everything was fine and told me to get some more rest. I protested, reminding her that she was barely recovered herself and needed help. She insisted that thanks to me, she'd slept well and was feeling better, urging me to go back to bed. For once, I listened. My body ached with exhaustion. As I burrowed under the blankets, my heart warmed watching Mom change Oliver's diaper and tickle him until he giggled. Though I wanted to help more, sleep overtook me. Hours later, I jolted awake and saw with horror that I was almost late for my shift at the bakery. As I hurriedly changed clothes, my mind wandered to the strange encounter with Zachary the day before. With a sinking heart, I thought about how he was arrogant yet charming, rich and probably just stringing me along with false promises about calling. Passing through the living room, I felt relieved to see Mom knitting clothes for Oliver, looking a bit stronger. I kissed my brother goodbye, quickly ate breakfast with some tea and the bread Nicholas had given me yesterday, then rushed off to work. To my surprise, Nicholas was waiting for me at the bakery with a big smile and a large package of pastries and baked goods. He explained that they had many extras today and he thought of my family. Overwhelmed by his generosity, I tried to protest that it was too much. He wouldn't hear of it, insisting he was happy to help and grateful for my extra assistance, knowing how much we needed it. Moved to tears, I hugged the old man and promised to share this feast with Mom and Oliver. I stored the package away and started work, relieved that at least today I wouldn't have to worry about lunch and dinner. The day flew by between serving morning regulars and preparing for the lunch rush. During my afternoon break, my thoughts drifted back to Zachary. I wondered if he truly wanted to spend time with me or if I was just some poor girl he'd found amusing. The very idea of having anything with someone like him seemed crazy to me. As if summoned by my thoughts, Zachary suddenly appeared while I was sitting on the sidewalk, trying to catch some fresh air. I rolled my eyes in annoyance, but his polite and cheerful greeting made me reluctantly respond. He expressed his delight at finding me there, saying he'd spotted me sitting alone and couldn't pass up another chance to see me. I replied coldly that he'd seen me and could go about his day. He pleaded with me to stay, confessing he hadn't stopped thinking about me since the day before and wanted to get to know me better, suggesting we grab a coffee, his treat. I looked at him curiously, thrown off by the sincerity in his eyes and a certain sparkle I couldn't quite interpret. Could he really be interested in someone like me? Still, such luxuries weren't meant for me, I was working, after all. I thanked him but explained I couldn't just leave work so easily. He persisted, begging for just a quick coffee, insisting I could tell my boss I'd be right back and no one would notice. His pleading eyes finally wore me down. With a resigned sigh, I stood up and told Nicholas I'd be back in a few minutes. Zachary led me to an elegantly decorated cafe nearby, worlds apart from the modest places I usually frequented. I felt out of place in my old clothes, but his gentle demeanor gradually put me at ease. Over coffee, we shared stories about our lives. I gave him a brief overview of Mom's illness and caring for Oliver, careful not to delve too deeply into the painful details. He talked about his university studies, the family business he was expected to inherit, and his father's strict demands and high expectations. Time slipped away, and when I glanced at the clock, I was horrified to see 45 minutes had passed. I needed to rush back before Nicholas noticed. Zachary apologized profusely as we practically ran back to the bakery. Thankfully, Nicholas hadn't noticed my extended absence. Before parting, Zachary begged to see me again, and I found myself trusting him enough to agree to meet at the same cafe after work the next day. I returned to work with a smile that lasted all day. That evening, while feeding Mom and Oliver the delicious pastries Nicholas had given us, I told her about my new boyfriend. She hesitated at first, worried that someone from such a prominent family might be trying to take advantage of me. But seeing the hope in my voice as I talked about him, she cautiously gave her blessing, warning me to take things slowly. The next few days fell into a wonderful routine. I'd work at the bakery in the mornings, meet Zachary for coffee during my lunch break, return to work in the afternoon, and care for my family in the evenings and early mornings. I grew increasingly comfortable with my new boyfriend. Zachary was attentive and gentlemanly, always finding pleasant topics of conversation without making me feel conscious about my humble background. After about 2 weeks, he finally gathered the courage to ask me to be his girlfriend officially. I happily accepted. Though I hadn't planned on falling in love, especially not with someone from a different social class, I couldn't deny the way my heart fluttered every time I saw him. Zachary promised to cherish and respect me, keeping our relationship secret from his parents until he found the courage to introduce me. As weeks passed, our romance blossomed further. We began meeting in the afternoons and evenings when Mom took Oliver for walks in the park with his stroller, leaving the house empty. Our kisses started shy and tentative but grew more passionate as we gave in to long-suppressed desires and emotions. For the first time in my life, I felt truly desired and loved, not just by any man, but by someone who was used to having the finest of everything. Nicholas noticed the positive change in me and seemed pleased, though he knew nothing of my secret relationship. Even Mom, despite her initial hesitation, was happy to see my smile return. But my happiness began to cloud over a few months into our relationship. I started feeling constantly tired, dizzy, and nauseous. At first, I blamed it on stress, but when my period was late, I fearfully bought a pregnancy test that confirmed my worst fears. Through my tears and anguish, I told Mom first, then nervously broke the news to Zachary, dreading his reaction. To my surprise, while he didn't yet have the courage to tell his parents or face his strict father's wrath, he promised to stand by me and take responsibility. I understood his reasons. Challenging them immediately would mean losing everything. Though I loved him desperately, deep down I always harbored fears and doubts about our social and economic differences. We had no choice but to keep our secret as my belly slowly grew, meeting in hidden places. The months passed slowly and heavily for me. Life seemed to rush by in a blur of morning sickness, dealing with difficult customers at work, caring for Mom and Oliver, and keeping my relationship with Zachary hidden. He was kind to me, bringing vitamins and supplements to help with the pregnancy, but he insisted on keeping the truth from his parents. Though I didn't want to pressure him, my fears and anxieties grew along with my expanding belly. One afternoon, 6 months into my pregnancy, I left work early because I could no longer bear the discomfort. As I headed to the pharmacy for some pain medication, I suddenly spotted Zachary's father's luxury car parked on the next street. Unable to contain my curiosity, I walked toward it and was shocked to see the distinguished man in his suit happily entering an apartment building with an attractive red-headed woman much younger than his wife. My blood boiled at the hypocrisy. This respected man who criticized my humble background was meeting with what appeared to be his mistress. Though I felt an overwhelming urge to confront him, my advanced pregnancy held me back. Filled with anger and helplessness, I continued to the pharmacy, praying for strength to finish my remaining shift at the bakery. That evening, I arranged to meet Zachary in the park during Mom's walk with Oliver. I knew I had to tell him what I'd seen. Zachary listened with visible distress but defended his father, trying to justify that many powerful men had mistresses, and it didn't mean they didn't love their families. His response infuriated me. I confronted him about his father's hypocrisy, how he could insult me for being poor while secretly meeting his mistress. I told him this situation couldn't continue, that his child deserved a name and a home, and if he wouldn't provide them, I would fight tooth and nail to make him acknowledge his paternal responsibilities. Our argument escalated until I collapsed on the bench, sobbing inconsolably. I was exhausted from living in the shadows. Though Zachary tried to comfort me and promised to fix things, I could see the hope dying in his eyes. With a heavy heart, I said goodbye and slowly walked home. I made sure to wipe away my tears before reaching home, not wanting to worry Mom further. For the next few days, I moved through life like a zombie. I performed my work mechanically, dodging Nicholas's concerned questions about my pale complexion. Zachary didn't appear again and stopped responding to messages. Perhaps he'd finally grown tired of me, or maybe I'd just been a passing fancy. I had no fight left in me and needed to focus on working through my pregnancy and giving my baby a future. One lunch break, I went as usual to buy fresh vegetables for soup for Mom, who had suffered a relapse. After paying with what little money I had left, I was heading out of the store with my grocery bag when I literally bumped into Zachary's imposing mother at the door. This elegant woman looked me up and down, her eyes stopping and widening at my clearly swollen belly. My face burned with shame as I watched recognition dawn in her eyes. I wanted desperately to run away, but it was too late. In a harsh tone, she demanded to know if I was the bakery girl her Zachary had been visiting, and if the baby was his. I nearly fainted right there on the spot. My legs trembled beneath me as tears of humiliation began to well up in my eyes. My condition told her everything she needed to know before I could even stammer out a response. She cut me off before I could explain, saying she never expected this from Zachary. She acknowledged my difficult situation but accused me of using it to trap her son, suggesting that women of my class would do anything to escape poverty. I pleaded with her, desperately trying to explain that I'd never trapped anyone, that our relationship had developed naturally, and that Zachary had promised to take responsibility. She silenced me with a sharp "enough." Then she issued her ultimatum: her husband must never know about this, or I would regret it for the rest of my life. With that, she pulled out a thick wad of bills from her purse and placed it on my trembling hand that still clutched the grocery bag. Then she turned on her expensive heels and left me standing there, a mess of fear, anger, confusion, and tears. Back home, my stomach was too upset to eat a single bite. After serving Mom her soup, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying that horrible confrontation in my mind. Maybe Zachary's mother was right after all, I didn't belong in their world. But I couldn't take that money, it felt like betraying my unborn child. Over the next few days, I tried repeatedly to contact Zachary, but it was useless. The phone number he had given me was disconnected. I suspected his mother had intervened, cutting off all contact to prevent her husband and son from discovering the truth and causing a scandal. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life, my soul feeling torn apart. Mom and Nicholas noticed the change in me, but no one knew the real cause of my sadness. One afternoon, about a month before my due date by my calculations, Mom had to leave urgently. A neighbor had been in an accident and needed help getting to the hospital. As expected, I was left alone to care for little Oliver. I prepared his dinner with our dwindling food supplies and fed him. Suddenly, Oliver began crying violently, as if in severe stomach pain. I tried desperately to comfort him, not knowing what to do. His cries were so sharp and intense that I feared something was seriously wrong. Without a second thought, I grabbed him and headed out. Holding my brother tightly, I tried to hail a taxi to the emergency room since we didn't have a car. Fortunately, I managed to stop one, climbed in with Oliver, and frantically directed the driver to the nearest children's hospital. In my panic, I completely forgot to notify Mom. My only concern was getting my little brother, who was crying heart-wrenchingly, seen by a doctor as quickly as possible. When we arrived, the kind taxi driver helped me get out and into the emergency room. I desperately called for help, and soon a nurse rushed over with a stretcher, placing Oliver on it to begin the examination. While they performed neurological tests and checked his reflexes, I stood by anxiously, fighting back tears. I stroked his tiny hand, whispering words of encouragement. After several agonizing minutes, the doctor finally approached with surprising news. Oliver had merely suffered severe stomach pains from something that didn't agree with him, and would recover quickly with treatment and prescribed medication. I exhaled deeply, feeling my soul return to my body. Holding my brother close, I covered him with kisses and promised to always protect and care for him. In that moment, all I wanted was to get home quickly and tell Mom everything was okay. After paying the doctor with the few coins left in my wallet and Oliver calmed down, I carried him outside. My heart sank when I saw the taxi that had brought us was gone. The driver must have grown tired of waiting and abandoned us there. I felt my world crumbling around me. Far from home, with no money for another taxi, there I was, 9 months pregnant, holding a baby, alone on the streets at night. The tears I'd been holding back burst forth as I clutched Oliver protectively, walking aimlessly along the sidewalk with no idea what to do. Then, to my astonishment, I spotted Zachary's father's car parked across the street. It made no sense for him to be in this area at this hour. Just then, I watched as an elegant red-headed woman stepped out of the car and entered a nearby building alone. My eyes widened in shock as I recognized her as the same woman I'd seen with Zachary's father months ago. She was his mistress, and this was their secret meeting place. Life seemed determined to keep throwing me into situations involving this family. A possibility occurred to me: if he'd come by car, he'd likely return soon to pick up his mistress. I knew I was playing with fire. Perhaps the wisest choice would be to avoid trouble and somehow get Oliver home. But desperation won out. Taking a chance on everything, I crossed the street and sat on the building's entrance steps with my brother in my arms, waiting. 30 minutes later, the distinguished man appeared. When he saw us, his eyes widened in confusion and he tried to avoid us by walking around, but I was quicker and blocked his path. With tears streaming down my face, I had nothing left to lose. I begged him not to ignore us, telling him this was his responsibility too. I told him how Zachary and I loved each other, how I was carrying his grandchild, yet he'd scorned me. I showed him how desperate and alone I was, all because of him. I pleaded with him to show some humanity and help us, if my baby and I meant anything to him at all. The man staggered backward, staring at my swollen belly and then at little Oliver's innocent face peering at him from my protective embrace. He seemed to be wrestling with internal conflict, glancing nervously at the building as if afraid his mistress might emerge and discover him. I pleaded again for help, explaining that I needed to get home and was exhausted by everything. Finally, something in him seemed to soften, and he quickly directed me to get in the car without asking questions. We drove to my modest home in silence. Before getting out, Knowing Mom had seen me come home late without warning, I fabricated a story about working late to avoid worrying her about what had really happened. After putting an already sleeping Oliver in his crib, I collapsed into my own bed, exhausted, wondering if this strange encounter might somehow soften Zachary's father's heart and help my unborn child have a real family. In the days that followed, I remained constantly on edge and nervous. As the baby's arrival drew closer, I waited for any sign that Zachary's family might help, but nothing came. That proud man had apparently chosen to pretend nothing had happened and wash his hands of the whole situation. One stormy night, I was struck by intense pain and screamed, waking my mother. The time had finally come, my labor had started, and we were alone in the house. We managed to call a neighbor to watch Oliver briefly while Mom helped me into a taxi. Between contractions, we made it to the small public hospital nearby, where with the help of Mom and the nurses, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. I named her Amelia. She was my only hope after so much suffering. Tears streamed down my face as I nursed her, promising to care for and protect her, even if I had to do it alone. Deep in my heart though, I desperately wished her father would at least acknowledge her existence and give her his name. My daughter and I spent those first few days in a shared hospital room, receiving the best care possible in our limited circumstances. I could barely sleep, constantly worried about my baby. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was news from Zachary, but it never was. One morning, a nurse took the baby for her routine checkup. I watched them disappear down the hallway and tried to rest, but suddenly realized hours had passed and they hadn't returned. Worried, I got up to look for my daughter. To my horror, one of the nurses informed me that an elegant couple had come, claiming to be the baby's paternal grandparents, and had taken her away with a court order. I felt the world spin around me. This couldn't be real. I searched frantically for my little girl until a doctor tried to calm me down and explain. Apparently, the father's family had appeared and exercised their rights over the baby. Given their financial resources, he explained, this was clearly in the baby's best interest. They would inform me later about visitation rights. Devastated, I fell to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. My hope, my only precious thing, my reason for living had been taken from me. I had no strength to fight against people powerful enough to buy judges and court orders at will. I had lost everything. It took several days before I was well enough to return home with Mom. Entering my room, I saw the empty, cold little crib I had prepared. I collapsed again, cursing my fate and wishing for death to escape this pain. Mom tried to console me, saying at least the baby would have opportunities and comfort, but it was little comfort to my shattered soul. I barely ate, and my health deteriorated gradually from extreme grief and weakness. 2 weeks after this tragic event, as I lay in bed staring into nothingness, I suddenly heard shouting outside. I recognized Zachary's voice desperately calling my name. I quickly stood up, surprised to see him there after so long, when I had no reason left to fight. He burst into the room breathless, tears in his eyes, clearly sensing my pain. Through his tears, he begged for forgiveness, explaining that his mother had kept him locked away when he told her everything, preventing him from finding me. He just learned about his parents taking our baby and wouldn't allow it. He wanted us to go together and get our baby back, insisting that while they might be the grandparents, we were the parents. We would fight together. I stood motionless, staring at him, not knowing what to say or do. His words were everything I'd longed to hear, a glimmer of hope. But after believing myself abandoned for so long and having my daughter cruelly taken away, I had no strength left. Suddenly, I felt dizzy and everything went white as I collapsed in front of Zachary. I heard him cry out my name in terror as my body, finally reaching its limit, gave out beneath me. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was Zachary frantically calling for an ambulance. It took several days before I opened my eyes again. I lay weakly in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm. Mom and Zachary sat beside me, their faces etched with worry. Through their tears, they explained how they'd had to stabilize me urgently, and how the cruel truth that Zachary's parents had been hiding was finally revealed. That truth had triggered my emotional collapse. I learned that Zachary's mother had found me first, orchestrating the taking of my baby during delivery and trying to keep me away for fear of scandal. But Zachary had finally stood up to his parents, reaching an agreement that he would acknowledge and care for our little baby until he could establish a stable home. That day, I finally held my beloved Amelia in my arms again. Tears of joy streamed down my face as I embraced my healthy, growing daughter. I accepted Zachary's heartfelt apology, and we promised to build the family we'd always wanted together, regardless of what society might think. After so much pain, our dream had become reality. Thanks to medical care, I was able to recover both physically and emotionally. Zachary's family kept their word, providing sufficient monthly support for me and my mother until he could get established. A year later, the three of us were living together in our own home, a wedding gift from Zachary's father when we legally married. Amelia grew up healthy and loved, flourishing in the comfortable environment her parents had fought so hard to provide. I learned that social prejudices could be overcome by love, and that new opportunities could rise from the ashes. My sad story became one of triumph, one I would tell my children years later to help them understand how fortunate we were to be part of this beautiful family.
If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support encourages us to continue delivering touching stories almost every day. Don't miss the amazing story that will appear next on your screen. We sincerely thank you for watching. Click the link on your screen now. A selection of specially curated, valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment awaits you. See you again soon.